It's finally Friday. It's Friday, Friday.
Thank God it's
Welcome back to another edition of the Friday Show presented by Woodbine Racetrack. This Saturday, 2 graded stakes on the turf for fillies and mares. The Trillium for older fillies and mares going 1 mile and a 16th on the turf, and the Royal North, a grade 2 Royal North for sprinters going 6 furlongs. I'm here with Natalie Voss, editor-in-chief of the Pollock Report. I'm Ray Pollock. It's been a busy week, Natalie. I mean, every week there's something is happening. It seems to be COVID-19 related. We should be talking about the opening weekend at Saratoga and the second weekend of Del Mar, featuring the return of maximum security for Bob Baffert for the first time. But what are we talking about instead?
Well, just as we've been talking about COVID for the last several months, it's here again. Del Mar announced yesterday that they would not be racing this weekend after they had 15 people test positive for the coronavirus in the jocks room. So I think that, as far as I know, is the first racing cancellation we've had since the reopening for COVID.
Well, actually, Lone Star Park had to cancel racing too, because again, it was somebody in the racing office. I think that the community spread. They worried about contact with jockeys, contact with people in the racing office, and so on. And I think with the jockeys at Del Mar, we're learning what the term community spread means. July 4th at Los Alamitos might be the day that a lot of these jockeys contracted the virus. 2 out-of-town jockeys flew in, Martin Garcia and Luis Saez, to the jocks room that day. We don't know what the setup was, but we do know that both of those jockeys tested positive the following week. Saez went to ride in New York, where he tested negative, and then he rode at Indiana. We don't know if he was tested there or not, but he was taken off his mounts at Keeneland during their meeting. And the other jockey that tested positive out of that, Garcia, was at, I think, Prairie Meadows, and I think he went to Indiana Grand as well. Then we had Victor Espinosa, and following that we had Flavian Pratt, which is when Del Mar decided to test all the jockeys, and here we are. No racing at Del Mar this weekend. They hope to resume on the 24th of July. This is more than, this whole thing, going back to when the pandemic was first declared in March. This has affected so many different elements of society, but also within racing. I mean, we talked about this earlier, but take us through a little bit of who's affected by all of this, Natalie.
Well, I mean, anything like this is bound to have a ripple effect, and I guess the place where that starts is probably with the jockeys. We saw lots of racetracks announce this week that they are no longer allowing their jockeys to travel. If you want to ride at Saratoga, then you can't leave Saratoga and come back, ride a stakes card someplace else and come back. You're going to have to stay there now. So jockeys are going to have to sort of pick which races they will and won't ride in, and that may actually give some opportunities for some guys who were based at a home track who normally get squeezed out on stakes race day. They might now get mounts they wouldn't have had the opportunity to before.
Yeah, Saratoga, the New York Racing Association, New York State Gaming Commission announced that owners will be able to attend the races at Saratoga, which is good. I think it was 8 owners per horse are allowed to sign up to attend. But at least the jockeys are working. My concerns are with the mutual clerks and the admissions people and the concession people. When you look at a town like Saratoga, and to a lesser extent Del Mar, but Saratoga especially, for a lot of people, the whole year wraps around this summer race meeting, and all of those people are really hurt economically.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about going to a typical race day at Saratoga, if you go down to Broadway in the evening after the race day to get dinner, everyone from the racetrack is up there. They're shopping, they're eating, they're socializing, and those are all businesses that are now not going to see that kind of foot traffic without fans or with a limited number of people permitted in. And I know that we covered that earlier this year. Tom Padula wrote a great article for us about the economic impact in Saratoga Springs, but that's not to be underestimated, because it looks like that's how this meet is going to go down at this point.
Yeah. The one thing that hasn't really been affected that much, at least so far, is wagering. In a lot of places, wagering is even with or up from last year. It's almost all of it being done through advanced deposit wagering companies. They're prospering, but of course we all know that less of the money wagered through an ADW company gets into the purse accounts and to the racetracks, because the ADW companies have to take their cut. So it's affecting a lot of things, and with less money going into purses, and seeing in many states that supply revenue into purses not opening, owners are running for a lot less money than they used to, and that's had a trickle-down effect into the area of bloodstock sales.
Right. I know that there may be some hesitation as an owner to go spend a lot of money this fall on horses when you haven't really seen your own horses for several months, the ones that you already have. And, there's also horses or stables who've kind of had their usual progression for the year or training program for the year derailed. So you might have owners who didn't get to see their horses, even if they were permitted to be at a track, they didn't get to see their horse run as many times because they may have been stuck, wherever they were when things first shut down. Some trainers have told us that they're running a little bit behind where they normally would be this time of year. So that's just kind of a lot to go up against as an owner and decide, I'm going to pour more money into this now.
Yeah, most owners don't get into this to make money. Let's face it; most of them lose money. They're in it for the enjoyment, and their patience is really being tested in a lot of places by not being able to enjoy going to the races. It was good to see owners at Keeneland. It'll be good to see the owners at Saratoga. We hope that these experiments, or these, this branching out a little bit of allowing some people into the racetrack, won't have negative consequences as far as owners getting contracting the virus and then having to reverse course on that. At Del Mar, so far, owners can come out for workouts, but they were not allowed to attend the races opening weekend, and I know that's something that Del Mar officials were working on. With this latest setback, I'm not so sure that that's going to happen. And without the enjoyment, there's a lot less incentive to go to horse sales and to say, gee, I want to spend money, because no one really knows when this is going to go back to normal, if we ever go back to what it was like before. I guess the new normal would be the way to look at it.
Right.
So any other week, if we were talking about the big story in racing, it would be Bob Baffert and the 2 positive tests that he got at Arkansas. But this has been relegated to the secondary story, which is kind of unusual. One of those was, of course, the winner of a division of the Grade 1 Arkansas Derby. Charlatan was disqualified from the win. Purse money was redistributed. Kentucky Derby points were redistributed, with Basin being the major beneficiary of that, getting 100 Kentucky Derby points. Gamine was disqualified from a win in an allowance race. The interesting thing to me on Charlatan isn't the purse money or anything. It's the fact that this was a horse that the breeding rights were sold. They announced it a few days after the Arkansas Derby, when he was a Grade 1 winner. Well, he's not a Grade 1 winner anymore. And you have to wonder, how does that affect the sale? How does that affect the sale price of Charlatan's breeding rights? If he never comes back and wins a Grade 1, you've got to think that that's a huge difference.
Right. And it certainly, puts a bit more pressure on his connections now to see if they can get a Grade 1 into him before the end of the year. But of course, he's been out with that ankle injury. And Bob Baffert said on the NTRA media teleconference yesterday that he doesn't expect him to be back in the barn until mid to late August. So that doesn't give you a lot of time in a normal year, and it's certainly not a normal year. So you do sort of wonder if you might see him stick around for a 4-year-old campaign when maybe ordinarily he wouldn't, just to sort of see what kind of resume they can build up.
I would hope so. Maybe that's the best thing to come out of it is that he'll race as a 4-year-old. Something I wish we could say about all of the other stud farms that retire horses, that buy the breeding rights and they want to retire the horses at the end of the 3-year-old year. Even in the case of Tis the Law, whose breeding rights were sold to Coolmore, I think that decision is left up to Saratoga Stable, and we hope that he gets through the year perfectly sound and runs as a 4-year-old, because there's just no reason to rush these horses off to stud at the end of their 3-year-old season. On the Baffert situation, I'm not going to ask you whether or not you believe the story about the Salonpas lidocaine patch that assistant trainer Jimmy Barnes wore and somehow worked its way into the system of both horses on Arkansas Derby Day. But I do want to ask you, do you think that racing is getting it right, that the horses should be disqualified no matter how the substance got into those horses' systems?
I mean, it's certainly something that's become more of a discussion in the last several years as testing has gotten a little bit more finely tuned and can pick up on smaller amounts of substances. That's a question and an argument that I've heard come up an awful lot, especially among regulatory vets. But I think that in this case, they applied the rule as written, which is if the horse has it in its system, it has to be disqualified. And I tend to look at it, if you're the connections of Basin, who finished behind that horse, if you found out that he had tested positive for something and then they weren't actually going to disqualify him because of the reasoning for why it was there, that would be a little bit tough to take, because obviously Basin would have had to have passed his post-race tests and didn't come back with anything in them. So it would seem a little bit unfair if you're the guy that finishes behind a horse that ends up coming up with a positive regardless of where it came from.
Well, it's very similar to the non-disqualification, the non-complaint against Justify when he won the Santa Anita Derby, was later found out to have tested for scopolamine, which the California Horse Racing Board looked at behind closed doors and said, this was contamination, we're not going to even pursue it. But again, it's a very similar case. California handled it one way, and Arkansas Racing Commission handled it the other way. And the way I read the rules, if it's in the horse's system, you have to have a hearing, you have to file a complaint, and probably disqualify the horse. California didn't do that. Arkansas did. Whether or not it was done on purpose or just an accident or something that was completely beyond the control of a trainer, the trainer responsibility rule is there, and you disqualify the horse. So I think Arkansas, as far as the forfeiting the win goes, I think they got it right.
Right, and I know that the ARCI model rule does allow the stewards some degree of latitude for not for the disqualification for the most part, but if they're going to make decisions about suspensions or fines to the owner or the trainer, they do allow them to consider mitigating circumstances. And so one explanation that I've heard many times is that if the substance is there, the horse has to be disqualified. But the area where you have some wiggle room for how intentional was this is when you're deciding any further penalties to the licensees.
Well, let's look at how some other sports do this. United States Anti-Doping Agency, USADA, is a group that the Jockey Club is pushing to oversee all medication policies in horse racing as part of the Horse Racing Integrity Act. Very recently, they reversed a decision, or they let a female boxer off the hook for testing positive for 2 substances that are banned in sports, in Olympic sports, and it's a very unusual ruling. The USADA came out with a statement saying that she was exonerated, this boxer, because the substance that was in her body when she was tested out of competition was actually transmitted to her during sexual contact with her boyfriend. It's almost in the you can't make it up category. But I've never heard that excuse before. It certainly wouldn't happen in horse racing, but the thing about that is they let her off the hook, but it was out of competition testing. It was not testing that was taken directly before or after an event. So they didn't have to decide whether or not to disqualify her from the event itself.
Right, and I think that I believe in that ruling they seem to indicate or hint that intent was a factor in their decision. They didn't believe that she intentionally exposed herself to the substance that she tested or substances that she tested positive for. The difficulty is I'm not quite sure how you prove intent. So if that was going to be something we were going to move over to horse racing, I think that you'd get into some really challenging legal arguments, and I'm not sure that it would be easy to figure out whose version of the truth was the correct one.
Yeah, I think that I'm a supporter of the federal legislation, and I think USADA would would give more leeway to trainers than most commissions currently do. If something has absolutely no effect on performance and it was not done intentionally, I think I have a feeling that USADA would actually be more lenient than the racing commissions that adjudicate these cases are today. So, from that standpoint, a lot of trainers who don't support the federal legislation, maybe they should take a little more closer look at this case with the female boxer and find out if maybe they would be better off with USADA overseeing racing than all of these different state racing commissions.
Well, I'm sure they would love assurance from USADA to promise to take their intent into account should that legislation go through, but I'm not sure that that's how that works.
All right, well, we've got a poll question on the Pollock Report about this subject, not about the boxer, but about the case of the Arkansas Derby. Let us know what you think. Thanks to Woodbine Racetrack for their support, and we'll see you next week.